The axe split through the oak with a sound like thunder, and Corvin's hands trembled not from the force of the blow, but from watching Naya emerge from the morning mist like a forest spirit made flesh. Her bare feet moved silent across the fasty, moss-covered ground, carrying a bucket of well water that caught the filtered sunlight streaming through ancient pines. 3 months they'd been building their cabin in this forgotten valley, and still his breath caught every time she appeared. "The foundation stones are settling crooked," she said, setting down the bucket and wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned early that love meant speaking hard truths. Corvin drove the axe deep into a stump and turned to study their half-built home. The structure stood defiant against the wilderness, its rough-hewn beams reaching toward sky like desperate fingers. But Naya was right. The northwest corner sagged where the spring rains had softened the earth beneath. "We knew this land wouldn't make it easy," he said, running calloused fingers along the warped timber. "The real estate agent in town called. U.S. crazy for buying 20 acres this far from civilization." Naya laughed, a sound that made the ravens pause their morning conversations. "Crazy for thinking we could build paradise with our own hands? Maybe, but I'd rather be crazy with you than sane with anyone else." She pressed herself against his back, her arms wrapping around his chest, and he felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his spine. They both knew what the old-timers in Pine Ridge had whispered, that this valley had swallowed 3 homesteads before theirs, that the mountain didn't suffer human ambition gladly. The creek ran wild each spring, carving new channels through what had once been someone's kitchen garden. Ancient foundations poked through the undergrowth like broken teeth, testimony to dreams the wilderness had reclaimed. But standing here with Naya's warmth against him and the smell of sawdust and possibility thick in the air, Corvin felt invincible. They'd saved for 7 years, working double shifts at the lumber mill and the diner, living in a cramped apartment above the hardware store while they dreamed of mornings exactly like this one. "Help me jack up that corner," Naya said, already moving toward their pile of tools. "We'll dig down to bedrock this time. Build it right, even if it takes twice as long." Corvin watched her hands, those beautiful, strong hands that had memorized every inch of his body, select a crowbar and level with practiced certainty. She'd grown up helping her grandfather build half the barns in 3 counties. He'd fallen in love watching her frame a door, the way she measured twice and cut once, the way she never cursed when something went wrong but simply figured out how to fix it. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing their valley in all its wild glory. Deer trails crisscrossed the meadow where they planned to plant vegetables. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals that whispered secrets about weather changes and the turning of seasons. This place would demand everything they had there. Sweat, their savings, probably their hearts, and give back only what it chose. "Ready?" Naya called, positioning the jack beneath the sagging beam. Corvin gripped the crowbar and nodded. They'd rebuild it as many times as necessary. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was about proving that love could take root even in the most unforgiving soil. The first winter nearly broke them both. Corvin woke on Christmas morning to find Naya standing at their single window, naked except for one of his flannel shirts, watching snow fall in sheets so thick he couldn't see the woodshed 20 feet away. The cabin creaked around them like a ship in a storm, their hastily chinked walls no match for the mountain's fury. "The pipes froze again," she said without turning around. Her breath fogged the glass as she spoke. "And I think something's wrong with the chimney." Smoke's backing up into the front room. He slipped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. Through the thin fabric of the shirt, he could feel goosebumps rising on her skin. The wood stove in the corner glowed cherry red, but its heat barely reached the far end of their one-room home. "We could still go to your sister's place in Denver," he murmured into her hair. "Stay the rest of the winter." Come back in spring when, no. The word came out sharp enough to cut glass. Naya turned in his arms, her green eyes blazing with the same fierce determination that had driven her to quit her job and follow him into this wilderness. We don't run. We don't give up. That's not who we are. But even as she spoke, Corvin could see the doubt creeping in around the edges of her certainty. The isolation was wearing on them both. 3 days since they'd seen another human being. 5 since their truck had managed the increasingly treacherous mountain road. Their radio crackled with weather warnings about a storm system that might dump another 2 feet of snow before New Year's. The coffee pot on the stove began to whistle, and Naya moved to pour them each a cup. Her hands shook slightly from cold or something else, he couldn't tell. They'd been living on canned beans and preserved vegetables for 2 weeks now, ever since their last supply run to town. I found deer tracks by the creek yesterday, Corvin sighed, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. Fresh ones. If this storm breaks, you could freeze to death trying to track an animal through 3 feet of snow, Naya interrupted. Or fall through ice and drown in that creek. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind howling through the pines outside. This wasn't how either of them had imagined their first winter. The cabin was supposed to be finished by now, properly insulated and weather-tight. Instead, they huddled together each night listening to their temporary home groan and sway, wondering if morning would find them buried under collapsed timbers. Naya set down her coffee and moved to the window again. Tell me why we're doing this, she said quietly. Tell me why we left everything behind to live like pioneers in the middle of nowhere. Corvin joined her at the glass, looking out at their valley transformed into an Arctic wasteland. But beneath the snow, he could still see it, the vision that had brought them here. The garden they would plant come spring. The workshop he'd build where she could craft the furniture designs that filled her sketchbooks. The life they would create together, measured not in mortgage payments and traffic jams, but in seasons and sunrises and the satisfaction of work done with their own hands. Because out there, he said, gesturing toward the invisible world beyond the storm, we were just going through the motions, working jobs we hated to pay for things we didn't need, coming home too tired to really see each other. Naya leaned against him, and he felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. And here we're building something that matters. Something real. He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face. Every board we cut, every stone we lay, it's ours. It's us. Even if the mountain takes it all back someday, at least we'll have had this. At least we'll have tried. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their fragile sanctuary, Naya smiled for the first time in days. Okay, she whispered, but I'm making you learn to bake bread. If we're going to be snowed in until spring, I'm not living on beans and regret. Spring arrived like a resurrection, and with it came the flood. Corvin stood knee-deep in muddy water that had been their living room 12 hours earlier, salvaging what he could from the wreckage of their first year's work. The creek, swollen with snowmelt and 3 days of relentless rain, had carved a new channel straight through their foundation. The books, Naya called from somewhere behind him, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Did you find the books? He turned to see her emerging from what used to be their bedroom, cradling a waterlogged box against her chest like a wounded child. Her hair hung in wet strings and mud streaked her face, but her eyes held that familiar fire that meant she was already planning their next move. Most of them, Corvin replied, holding up a sodden paperback whose pages had swollen to twice their normal size. Your grandmother's recipe collection is somewhere under all this mess, though. The silence that followed was worse than screaming would have been. Those recipes, handwritten cards, and pages torn from newspapers accumulated over 4 generations of women who'd learned to make something from nothing represented more than cooking instructions. They were Nia's connection to the mothers and grandmothers who taught her that love lived in details, in the careful measurement of flour and the patient stirring of gravy. "We'll find them," Corvin said, wading toward her through the ankle-deep water that covered their floor. "When this dries out, we'll go through everything piece by piece." But they both knew the truth. The wooden recipe box that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the chaos of 5 family moves had finally met its match in their stubborn dream of wilderness living. Nia set down her salvaged books and wiped her eyes with the back of her muddy hand. "Maybe the old-timers were right," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of water still trickling through their walls. "Maybe this place really is cursed." Corvin reached her and pulled her close, not caring that they were both soaked through and covered in mud. Her body shook against his, whether from cold or emotion, he couldn't tell. Through the gaping hole, where their front door used to hang, he could see their valley transformed once again. Where their vegetable garden should have been, a new stream meandered through rich soil that would grow nothing but regret. "Look at me," he said, tilting her chin up until their eyes met. "Do you remember what you told me the day we bought this land? About pioneers and second chances?" Nia's mouth quirked into the shadow of a smile. "That was before I knew the land had it out for us personally." "The land doesn't care about us one way or the other," Corvin replied, gesturing at the flooded remains of their cabin. "It just is. We're the ones who decided to love it anyway. We're the ones who keep choosing to start over." Through the ruined doorway, morning sunlight slanted across the standing water, turning it into something beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to human ambition. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called liquid notes that spoke of seasons turning and life persisting despite everything. "So what do you want to do?" Nia asked. "Rebuild on higher ground? Pack up and admit defeat? Find a nice suburban house with reliable plumbing and neighbors close enough to borrow sugar from?" Corvin considered their options while water lapped at their ankles and their dreams lay in ruins around them. The smart thing would be to call it quits, salvage what they could, and start over somewhere more forgiving. But looking at Nia's face mud-streaked and exhausted but still beautiful, still fierce, he realized that leaving had never really been a choice. "We rebuild," he said. "But this time we build smart. Stone foundation, elevated on posts. We study the waterways and respect them instead of fighting them." Nia was quiet for a long moment, surveying the wreckage of their first attempt at paradise. Then she reached into the muddy water and pulled up a single index card, its ink smeared, but still readable. "Grandma's cornbread recipe," she said, holding it up like a small victory flag. "Guess we're staying after all." 2 years later, their second cabin stood on stilts like a crane poised for flight, and Corvin watched Nia's belly grow round with their first child as summer deepened into gold and crimson. She moved through their elevated sanctuary with the careful grace of someone carrying precious cargo, one hand always resting protectively over the life they'd created together. "He's active tonight," she said, settling beside him on the wraparound porch they'd built after learning that comfort mattered as much as survival. "Feel." Corvin pressed his palm against the curve of her abdomen and felt the strong kick of tiny feet that would someday walk this valley, climb these mountains, maybe even build their own dreams in this unforgiving paradise. The sensation filled him with equal parts wonder and terror. "What if we can't keep him safe out here?" he asked, voicing the fear that had been growing alongside their child. "What if something happens and we're too far from help?" Nia laced her fingers through her wedding ring forged from metal salvaged from their first cabin, catching the last light of sunset. "What if we raise him in some sterile suburb where the biggest danger is boredom? Where he never learns that beautiful things require sacrifice?" Below them, their valley spread out in the gathering dusk, transformed by their second attempt at domestication. The vegetable garden flourished in raised beds designed to work with the seasonal flooding instead of fighting it. Fruit trees they planted in their first year now bore apples and pears. A chicken coop occupied high ground near the workshop where Naya crafted furniture that gallery owners in Denver fought to display. "I want him to know this," she continued, her voice soft but certain. "I want him to understand that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every day, even when the work is hard and the outcome uncertain." A meteor streaked across the darkening sky, and they both made wishes they didn't share. Corvin's hand remained on her belly, feeling the steady rhythm of new life preparing to enter their complicated world. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the ridges, and an owl answered from the old-growth pine that shaded their bedroom window. "The midwife says everything looks good," Naya said. "Strong heartbeat, good position. She thinks he'll come early October, when the leaves are changing." Corvin tried to imagine holding his son for the first time, teaching him to split wood and read weather and build things that would last. But mostly he imagined protecting him from the wilderness they'd chosen, from the isolation that could turn deadly in winter, from the thousand ways this beautiful, ruthless place could break a human heart. "We should have a backup plan," he sighed, "in case something goes wrong during labor. A way to get you to the hospital in town quickly." Naya shifted in her chair, trying to find a comfortable position as their child performed what felt like gymnastics routines inside her. "Corvin, look at me." He turned to meet her eyes, green as the mountain pines that surrounded their home. "We've survived flood and fire and isolation and doubt," she said. "We've learned to live with uncertainty as a daily companion. This baby is going to be born into a family that knows how to adapt, how to persevere, how to build something lasting even when the odds are against us." As if summoned by her words, the baby kicked again strong and insistent, demanding to be acknowledged. Corvin laughed despite his fears, imagining their child inheriting Naya's stubborn optimism and his own careful planning, growing up to be someone who could thrive anywhere. "He's going to be beautiful," Naya whispered. "Wild and beautiful and completely ours." The first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, and fireflies began their ancient dance among the meadow grasses. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, repairs to make, supplies to gather before the first snow, preparations for becoming parents. In a place where the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away. But tonight, sitting on their hand-built porch with their unborn child moving between them like a blessing, anything seemed possible. The contraction started during the blizzard naturally. Corvin paced their cabin like a caged wolf while Naya breathed through each wave of pain, timing them with the mechanical precision that had served them through every crisis their valley had thrown at them. Outside, wind howled through the pines with a fury that made their elevated sanctuary sway like a ship at anchor. 15 minutes apart, Naya announced, her voice remarkably calm for someone whose body was preparing to bring new life into their isolated world. "We have time." But Corvin could see the doubt creeping into her eyes as she glanced toward the window, where snow fell so thick it seemed solid. The road to town, if it could still be called a road under 3 feet of snow, might as well have led to the moon. Their nearest neighbor, old Henrik, who'd built his own place on the far side of the ridge, was probably snowed in just as thoroughly. "The satellite phone," Corvin said, reaching for the emergency device they'd bought after learning Naya was pregnant. "I'll call the midwife, see if she can talk us through." "Already tried," Naya interrupted, gesturing toward the phone on their kitchen table. "Storm knocked out the satellite connection an hour ago." The words hung between them like a physical weight. They'd planned for this scenario, had practiced what to do if labor started when they were cut off from help. But planning and living through it were different creatures entirely. Corvin felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with watching the mountain assert its dominance over human intentions. Another contraction gripped Naya. Stronger this time, and she gripped the back of their handmade chair until her knuckles went white. Okay, she breathed when it passed. That was 12 minutes. Corvin moved to the supplies they'd assembled: clean sheets, sterile scissors, everything the midwife had told them they might need. His hands shook as he checked their inventory, remembering her warnings about complications that could arise, problems that would require immediate medical intervention they couldn't provide. Stop, Naya said firmly. Stop thinking about everything that could go wrong and help me think about everything that's going to go right. She was right, as usual. Corvin set aside the fears and focused on what he could control. He lit more candles, put water on to boil, spread clean sheets on their bed. The practical task steadied him, reminded him that they'd faced impossible odds before and survived through careful preparation and stubborn determination. Tell me about him, Naya said as he helped her from the chair to their bed. Tell me what our son is going to be like. The contractions were coming faster now, 9 minutes apart, then 7. But Corvin let his voice carry them both away from the pain and fear, spinning stories about the child who was fighting to join them. He described strong hands that would help rebuild whatever storms destroyed, a curious mind that would want to understand every bird call and wildflower, eyes that would see beauty in the harsh paradise they'd chosen. He'll know how to read the sky, Corvin said, stroking Naya's sweat-damp hair as she worked through another contraction. He'll understand that storms pass and seasons change, and love is what makes the waiting worthwhile. The wind outside seemed to howl in response, rattling their windows and reminding them that they were entirely alone with this miracle unfolding between them. But in the warm glow of candlelight, with Naya's hand gripping his and their child preparing to make his debut, Corvin felt something shift inside his chest. Not fear anymore, but anticipation, wonder, the absolute certainty that they were about to meet the person they'd been building this life for all along. 5 minutes, Naya gasped, and her smile was fierce with joy and exhaustion and the primal power of creation itself. He's coming, Corvin. Our baby's really coming. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside their elevated sanctuary, love was about to take its most tangible form, yet dawn broke clear and impossibly bright. The storm spent and their world transformed into crystalline perfection. Corvin stood at the window holding his son Darius. They'd decided, after Naya's great-grandfather who'd homesteaded in Montana and watched sunlight turn fresh snow into diamond fields that stretched to the horizon. Look, he whispered to the tiny face peering up at him with eyes the same impossible green as his mother's. This is your kingdom, little prince. Every tree, every rock, every impossible morning like this one. Behind him, Naya slept deeply for the first time in 36 hours, exhausted but radiant in the way of women who've accomplished miracles. The birth had been long and difficult, but blessedly uncomplicated, as if their valley had finally decided to show mercy to the stubborn couple who refused to be driven away. Darius made a small sound, not quite crying but not contentment either. And Corvin found himself swaying automatically, some ancient rhythm that seemed to calm the baby's restlessness. Through the window, he could see their chickens pecking at scattered grain in the snow, and smoke rising from Henrik's chimney across the ridge. Life continuing, adapting, persevering. Your mother saved us both last night, Corvin murmured, adjusting the blanket around his son's tiny form. Did you know that? When things got scary and I started to panic, she just looked at me with those eyes that could stop avalanches and said, "We've got this." And we did. The satellite phone crackled to life as the storm's interference finally cleared, and Corvin fumbled to answer it one-handed, not wanting to disturb the warm weight of his child against his chest. "Everything all right up there?" Henrik's gravelly, Voice carried concern and relief in equal measure. Saw your emergency flare go up around midnight. We're fine, Corvin replied, surprised by how his voice cracked on the words. Better than fine. Henrik, we have a son. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Corvin wondered if the connection had failed. Then Henrik's laughter boomed through the speaker, rich and warm and completely at odds with his reputation as the mountain's most confirmed hermit. Well, I'll be damned. A baby born in the blizzard of the century. That boy's going to be tougher than pine bark and twice as stubborn. Naya stirred at the sound of voices, her eyes fluttering open to find Corvin silhouetted against the snowy morning light. Their son cradled in his arms like something precious and fragile and absolutely perfect. How's he doing? She asked, her voice husky with exhaustion and wonder. He's taking inventory, Corvin replied, watching Darius's eyes track the movement of sunlight across the cabin walls. Getting acquainted with his new home. Naya struggled to sit up and Corvin moved to help her, carefully transferring their son to her waiting arms. The sight of them together, his fierce, beautiful wife and the child they'd created against all odds, hit him with a force that made his knees weak. The road's going to be impassable for days, Henrik's voice continued from the forgotten phone. But I've got supplies if you need anything. Medical kit, extra food. Just holler. Thank you, Corvin managed, his throat tight with emotion. This was what they'd built here, he realized. Not just a home that could weather literal storms, but a community of souls who chose to look out for each other in a place that demanded everything and promised nothing. Naya looked up from studying their son's tiny fingers, and her smile was radiant enough to melt snow. He's perfect, she whispered. Absolutely perfect. Darius chose that moment to open his mouth and release a cry that would have impressed a mountain lion, lusty and demanding and utterly alive. The sound echoed off their cabin walls and seemed to announce to the wilderness itself that a new voice had joined the ancient conversation between human will and natural force. Welcome home, little man, Corvin said, gathering both wife and child into his arms. Outside their window, their valley sparkled in the morning sun. Beautiful and terrible and absolutely there's not 20-5 years later, Corvin watched his son Darius guide a group of visitors around their property, pointing out the flood channels they'd learned to work with instead of against. The root cellar that had kept them fed through countless winters, the workshop where 3 generations of furniture now bore the family's distinctive craftsmanship. The boy had grown into a man who moved through their valley with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his skin and his place in the world. The original cabin foundation is still visible over there, Darius was saying, his voice carrying the same warm authority Naya had possessed when explaining why they wouldn't give up, couldn't give up, despite every reasonable argument for surrender. My parents built 3 different homes on this land before they figured out how to listen instead of fight. Corvin smiled, remembering. The second cabin had burned in a lightning strike during Darius's 3rd summer. The 3rd had been damaged by a mudslide that taught them where not to build. But each failure had taught them something essential about resilience, about the difference between stubbornness and wisdom. Naya emerged from their current home, the 4th iteration, built to last and designed to bend with whatever the mountain threw at them, carrying a tray of coffee and the cornbread recipe she'd finally memorized by heart after losing her grandmother's card in that first flood. Her hair was silver now, pulled back in the same practical braid she'd worn since she was 20, and her hands showed the beautiful scars of a life spent building things that mattered. The architectural magazine wants to feature us in their sustainable living issue, she called to Corvin. Something about couples who've made unconventional choices work long-term. He laughed, thinking about the young man and woman who'd first stood in this valley with nothing but dreams and determination. They'd imagined they were conquering the wilderness, proving something about the power of human will over natural force. Instead, they'd learn to dance with uncertainty, to build their love strong enough to weather any storm. Darius finished his tour and jogged over to join them. His own wife and infant daughter close behind. "The developer from Denver wants to know if you'd consider selling the North Meadow," he said. "Apparently there's a market for authentic wilderness experience vacation homes." Corvin and Naya exchanged the kind of look that married couples perfect over decades of shared crisis and triumph. They'd been approached before by developers, by reality TV shows, by anyone who thought their story could be packaged and sold to people hungry for meaning in an increasingly artificial world. "What did you tell him?" Naya asked. "Same thing. I always tell them," Darius replied, bouncing his daughter on his hip while she reached for the butterflies dancing around the wildflowers they'd learned to cultivate instead of eliminate. "That this place isn't for sale because it was never really for sale in the first place. It chose us, not the other way around." The visitors from the architectural magazine set up their cameras and lighting equipment, preparing to document what they called an inspiring example of sustainable homesteading. But Corvin knew they'd missed the real story, that love wasn't about finding a perfect place or building a perfect life, but about choosing each other again and again, especially when the ground beneath your feet refused to hold still. "Ready for your interview?" the photographer asked, adjusting her lens to capture the family against the backdrop of mountains that had tested and shaped and ultimately blessed them. Naya took Corvin's weathered hand in her own, their wedding rings remade, twice now from salvaged metal catching the afternoon light. Around them, their valley stretched in all directions, marked by human determination but still fundamentally wild, still capable of surprise and challenge and wonder. "We're ready," Naya said, and Corvin heard in her voice the same certainty that had carried them through flood and fire and blizzard and birth. The same love that had built not just a home, but a legacy that would outlast whatever storms the future might bring. Their granddaughter laughed at something only she could see, and the sound echoed across the meadow where they'd learned that the best things in life weren't the ones you conquered, but the ones you earned through patience and perseverance and the radical act of refusing to give up on what mattered most. The land would take it all back someday, as they'd always known it would. But for now, for this perfect moment suspended between past struggles and future uncertainties, they had built something beautiful. They had built something that would last.